Hey everybody, let's talk about nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is huge, it's super important, and it's interesting. Today we're going to talk about 4 general aspects of nonverbal communication. We're going to describe some of the characteristics, some of the functions that nonverbal communication plays in our lives. We're going to talk about some different types of nonverbal communication and some best practices to become competent in nonverbal communication ourselves. So first, we should probably define nonverbal communication. What exactly is nonverbal communication? We tend to use the definition that it's messages expressed through non-linguistic means. Linguistic being language. So it's everything that goes with the message that isn't the actual words. You ever hear that term that goes, it's not what you say, but how you say it? That's nonverbal communication. It's everything that goes with the communication. And we'll give you a couple examples right off the top. We have tone, where we can vary our rate or our pitch or volume of how we're saying something. We have gestures, like if someone asks you something and you don't know the answer, you just sort of shrug your shoulders. That's a gesture. We have body movement and hand movement. Something along the lines of moving your hands a lot while you talk or nodding your head while you listen. We also have emphasis, where we place greater emphasis in a different part of a sentence or a message to really convey that we feel strongly about that particular part. And nonverbal has a lot of value in communication. The experts vary exactly on where they place it, but it's around 85 to 92% of all communication. All human communication is communicated nonverbally. The real interesting thing about it is we're not very good at it. Dogs are great at nonverbal communication. Cats are pretty good at nonverbal communication. You can take a dog at 8 weeks old and pluck them away from their family and everything they've ever known and bring them to your house, this completely alien world, and try to train them on different things. And they're going to be trying to give you all kinds of nonverbal messages. They'll be flaring their nose. They'll be looking at you with a particular, stance of their eyebrow. All kinds of messages that we generally don't understand. But within a matter of a couple weeks, they learn our language and our nonverbal communication really, really well, to the point where they adapt their entire language just to us before they're even a couple months old. And one of the easiest ways to think about nonverbal communication is to look at the paralanguage. That's all the things that go along with the language. Tone, emphasis, volume, like we said before. And one of the easiest ways is just take an example. So we have this sentence. We have to move now. And we can say it a bunch of different ways. We can be sad. Oh, we have to move now. We could be angry. We have to move now. Or if we say it urgent, we have to move now. Surely there's a lot of different ways to convey the message that we're trying to send just with the way that we're saying it. So let's take a look at some other characteristics of nonverbal communication. It's primarily relational, as in it depends on your relationship with the other person. Nonverbal messages and maybe a look on your face would mean one thing to your family, whereas it might mean something completely different to a new friend that you've made. It helps manage our identities and really define our relationships. It helps us present ourselves to the outer world, show the outer world who we are and who we want to be. And it helps regulate closeness in a relationship. Perhaps a person stands very close, or they stand far away, or there's a different power dynamic there where one person has more power to come and go and the other person does not. It conveys a lot of emotion. That's the easiest one we can think of. A giant smile, or when someone says, yay, right? All nonverbal communication. Unfortunately, it's also ambiguous. That is, it's vague, like we talked about in our intercultural communications. What we often think a nonverbal message means isn't always what it means, which is why we have to take a close look at these things. And one of the things to keep in mind is that culture influences almost everything. Generally, in Western culture, when we give people the thumbs up, we mean like, yes, that's good, right? But back in Roman culture, the thumbs down was better. If a gladiator was in the arena and was just about to die because another gladiator is about to kill them, then they would look up to the emperor. And the emperor would give the thumbs up, which meant, yes, kill him. Or the thumbs down, which meant, like, no, let him live. Somewhere along the line, it got changed around a little bit. Because culture changes and people change. We also have a number of functions of nonverbal communication. We have repeating, which serves the function to enforce a message. Something like when we say, oh, it's over there, and we also point at the same time. We're enforcing that message. We have substituting, which we often call emblems. For example, if someone wants to convey the message that everything is good or what you just said was good, we could give them the okay, right? But keep in mind that these things vary by culture too. In America and Canada, you give someone okay, like this image here, and it means like, yeah, okay, good. But if you do that to someone who you're driving next to on the road in England, they're going to take it a completely different way. Over in England, they would receive this message, something along the lines of how we show people our favorite finger in this country when we don't appreciate how they're driving. So it's culturally based. We use nonverbal communication to complement messages. We call that illustrators. Like when we're thinking and maybe we scratch our head, or we'll rub our chin. I'm a chin rubber. We'll rub our chin, or even just make a sound, right? Nonverbal. And accenting, which is when we put emphasis on various words in a sentence, like we just did when we were talking about having to move. And we have regulating, which literally is regulating the flow of a conversation. They're tiny little nonverbal movements we give to a person when we're finished speaking or are just about to finish speaking to let them know that it's okay for them to jump in and start talking. We have contradicting messages. We can easily see this one in sarcasm. Like when someone says they're sorry. Oh, sorry. Like they're not really sorry. They say it like that, right? It's contradicting, which has led to an expression, which I'm sure you've all heard before. Sorry, not sorry. It's contradicting the actual word that we're using. Then there's deceiving. Some people are really good at deceiving other people, and we try to use our body and our eyes. People that have a high amount of monitoring their own behavior, we call them high self-monitors. They tend to be better at deception if they choose to be deceitful. That's not to say that everyone who pays attention to how they present themselves in public or in a conversation are deceitful, but if they want to be, those people tend to be better. And speaking of deception, there's a lot of interesting studies. I took an entire nonverbal course from a motorcycle cop up in San Francisco. He taught at San Francisco State. And it turns out that people really aren't as good at spotting liars as they think. And those double-blind studies, it turns out that most police officers are about as good at spotting a liar as most college students. Without having like a baseline for that person we're talking to, like what their normal nonverbal behaviors are, it's often pretty difficult to tell when they're lying, unless, of course, they're a horrible liar. And we can all think of an example of that, I'm sure, somewhere in our lives. And then finally, we have manipulators, which are different than the liars we were just talking about. A manipulator is moving or manipulating one's body. Like if somebody tugs on their ear, has a habit of tugging on their ear when they're talking, or it is rubbing their neck when they're giving you a message. Now, these things may or may not mean that they're being deceitful. They may or may not mean that they're being truthful at all. It may not mean that they're thinking anything particularly of you. One of the things about manipulators is until you get to know someone, what does it mean when they really rub their elbow like that? It's best if we don't make any real judgment calls about them. And so we have a few different types of nonverbal communication categories. And we focus on different areas of how we structure our social interactions through different nonverbals. We have chronemics, which is essentially the use of time. The easiest one to think of is like when is late? When is someone late? If I am to be at a location by 5 p.m. and I get there at 5:04, is that late or is that still considered on time? How about 5:10? If I'm 5:10, is that late or is that still considered on time? Chronemics. It's all about how we're using our time. In Western culture, especially in the US, we tend to be pretty focused on time. But in a lot of other cultures and subcultures, it's not as big of a deal. We use haptics, which is how we touch each other. I tend to touch people on the shoulder when we're getting along well. Innocuous, doesn't mean anything. I touch them on the shoulder. But when I was learning to be a teacher, one of the things that we learned was don't ever touch the students. There's so many different ways that can be understood differently, or there's so many different ways that it can go bad, that touch in one particular situation might mean something. In another situation, it might mean something completely different. We have kinesics, which is the study of movement. And this would be sort of like how we're moving our body. Like if you have that cool walk, you sort of swing your arms and you got a little bump in your step. Or you have an aggressive walk. Your upper body's tight and you're making direct eye contact to someone. You're coming in fast. The message would probably be well received in that instance that you are not happy. We have proxemics, which is literally where we get the word proximity. It's our space. Again, how close are we standing to a person? How close can we still stand to that person without being rude? How comfortable would they be if we stand really close? Have you ever been in a conversation with a close talker? A person who just stands really, really close and it makes you feel a little uncomfortable? If that's the case, the two of you have a different idea of proxemics in your conception of nonverbal communication. And speaking of proxemics, that brings up distance zones. Your textbook lists all kinds of distance zones. Distance zone for this and a distance zone for that. And we're not going to focus on that so much because it varies so much with a culture. In our intercultural conversation we had, in one culture, standing 2 feet away from someone means one thing. In another culture, it means something completely different. But generally, across cultures, and so this is the one we will pay attention to, the intimate space. It's about like skin to skin contact up to about 18 inches away, up to about 1.5 feet away. Like if someone's in that space, they are in your intimate space. And someone can be doing this aggressively and get their face right up in your face. Or, you could be having a really positive intimate encounter with someone. And when they're skin-to-skin contact, or right next to skin-to-skin contact. They sit right next to you on a bench, or you're holding hands, or something along those lines. So we have generally 3 rules of thumb to keep in mind when building our nonverbal competence. First of all, we want to pay less attention to the words, and we want to watch for how the person's delivering this message. We call that subtext. We're going to pay less attention to the actual words they choose and pay a lot more attention to how they're delivering that. In the area that we live in, we engage in this a healthy amount because we come into encounters with people who speak different languages or speak the same language but in a different way. We use this a lot. It's important to keep in mind that when we go into an environment where everybody's speaking the same language we speak and everybody seems to have the same type of vocabulary around them, to pay more attention to how people are delivering the message than the actual words. Because as we've already talked about, the meaning is in the people, not in the words. And when we're not sure, perception checking. You've probably figured out by now, I'm a big fan of perception checking. When in doubt, if at all possible, it's always a good idea to ask. We use that mirroring language. Hey, so I'm hearing you say this. Does that sound about right? And then you can get a real baseline from that individual's form of expressing their nonverbal communication. And then the easiest is to pay attention to your own nonverbal communication behavior. Generally, how we get better at things like this is we pay attention to what we're doing, just noticing it oftentimes, and what's motivating us to move that way or say a different word that way. Getting to know what's motivating you is often your first really big step to understanding other people. So today we've covered 4 main aspects of nonverbal communication. We talked about some major characteristics of nonverbal communication, some of the functions it plays in our lives and in our interactions, a couple different types of nonverbal communication, and then the big 3 to build competence. Thanks for your time. Have a great afternoon.